Hello, and welcome to Agile University. Throughout this video, we will discuss how prioritization occurs during the Agile process at HHSC. Let's get started. As you may remember from the Agile Fundamentals course, which can be found on the Agile portal, we discussed the Agile framework and the overall systems development lifecycle at HHSC with Agile. In this video, we'll be discussing specifically on prioritization throughout the framework, the governing bodies involved, and the steps that occur from prioritizing themes to assigning user stories to sprint teams. Remember, in Agile, we break down our work products into themes, epics, user stories, and tasks. Let's start with themes. The prioritization of these items is managed by a governing body comprised of leadership across business and IT, who form the HHS Business Area Steering Committee. Members of this committee work with their respective areas to identify upcoming project needs, which are defined as themes. Once themes are finalized, each area works with their teams to prioritize their list using the Moscow method before they are reviewed by the larger HHS Business Area Steering Committee. The steering committee then determines the priority of the compiled must-have and possible should-have themes. This occurs by weighing each theme's business value, time sensitivity, and risk opportunity value. The outcome of this activity becomes a consolidated prioritized backlog of must-have and possibly should-have themes that make up the product roadmap. Take note that this list will be considered a quarterly planning guide, but staff will have the ability to add newly identified projects for consideration on a monthly basis. The HHS Business Area Steering Committee will review all priority projects and emergency items and is responsible for making updates to the roadmap as needed. Additionally, non-emergency work items are presented and assessed each quarter. So, you may be wondering when the epics are developed. This occurs after the business area defines their list of themes, which is after they are submitted to the HHS Business Steering Committee. Business and IT work to refine the epics and develop high-level user stories. Then, HHS IT and their partners complete high-level epic estimates, also known as HLEEs, for the epics related to the themes prioritized for the upcoming cycle set. This is done in order to determine the level of effort, technical dependencies, and affected IT stakeholders required to implement the epic. The high-level estimates include an overview of the desired enhancements, assumptions, and constraints where applicable. The HHS Business Area Steering Committee uses the inputs from HHS IT to update the product roadmap, which is prioritized based on scope, business impact, and estimated effort. The HHS Agile Governance Team is responsible for drafting the release cycle set plan, which details the implementation schedule. This team is comprised of business and IT stakeholders with subject matter expertise, who are closely involved in the business and development processes. From here, HHS product owners and IT will partner to take the prioritized epics defined during the roadmap activities and develop detailed user stories, including their acceptance criteria. For more details on how to write user stories, please refer to the Defining Effective User Stories course, which can be found in the Agile portal. As a refresher, let's review a few key terms and explanations. A sprint cycle refers to a set of sprints that are executed concurrently. Then, the cycle set refers to 4 planned sprint cycles that occur in a series and will roll up into a major release. The 4th sprint cycle is generally planned to be a release readiness cycle, where all code modules will be integrated and tested prior to the completion of the cycle set. Remember, as we move into the beginning of the sprint planning meeting will occur, where the product owner meets with the Scrum team. They collaborate to create the sprint plan, which is followed by story point estimation and the task breakdown session. Once these activities are completed, development for the sprint may begin. So, from here, the sprint team perform development and testing of tasks. Don't forget that at any point during the sprint, product owners and their designated product teams are responsible for monitoring and grooming the backlog with input from their IT counterparts. At the end of the sprint, any additional items in the product backlog are mutually agreed upon by the product owner and Scrum Master. These items are then reviewed by the HHSC Agile Governance team for final approval and reprioritization. It's important to remember a backlog item could be addressed in a subsequent sprint in the same cycle, or added to the next sprint cycle depending on the criticality and other prioritized items. Finally, defects are one of the last ways that items can be identified and prioritized in the backlog. Defects can be identified at 4 different points. This may be in the active sprint, regression testing, the release readiness sprint, or production. The prioritization of each defect is based on a 5-point severity scale and escalated to the appropriate governing bodies depending on the impact and immediacy for prioritization. Defects identified during the active sprint are primarily the responsibility of the sprint team. These are intended to be resolved within the active sprint. However, defects that cannot be addressed during the active sprint will be deferred for future prioritization. The testing team performs regression testing on the most recently completed sprint. Defects identified by the testing team at this time are assigned to the respective Scrum Masters for resolution. If defects cannot be resolved by the end of the regression cycle, then they are deferred for future prioritization. Recall the 4th sprint cycle in the cycle set is the release readiness sprint. Again, the testing team will be responsible for identifying defects as they complete end-to-end integration and regression testing. All identified defects during the release readiness sprint are expected to be resolved by the end of the sprint cycle. Again, if defects are not resolved by the end of this cycle, then they are deferred for future prioritization based on discussions between business and IT. Lastly, there are those defects discovered in production post-release. When this occurs, it is managed by the help desk, IT, and the release management team following the established issue escalation and prioritization process, which ultimately results in creating a maintenance SR where it is then allocated for implementation in a future release. The defects process remains the same from waterfall with the same reporting mechanisms and resolution flow. As such, regular SR maintenance defect triage meetings will occur to communicate defect status and targets for resolution. Key participants in this meeting will include the Release Management Maintenance Coordinator, subject matter experts as required, developers, and testing staff. The defects identified during the post-release activities will be triaged and assigned to the corresponding sprint team that implemented the change. Sprint teams will resolve the defect and use the corresponding sprint development environment to test the changes before promoting to the iTest environment. Once all these activities occur, the code is deployed to the release and the changes are effective in the system. To recap, the governing bodies that determine prioritization from the theme level down to how projects are assigned to sprint teams to implement specific user stories are as follows. The HHS Business Area Steering Committee reviews themes. The HHS Agile Governance Team reviews and assigns epics and user stories to sprint cycles. The product owner and/or product team will be responsible for continuous maintenance of the backlog. And the defect triage meeting manages defects identified post-release go-live. So that covers the prioritization in the Agile process. As always, before we sign off, let's prove how sharp you really are with a few of these refresher questions.
All right, now here we go.